Anthony Sowell was a former United States Marine turned serial killer who murdered 11 women between 2007 and 2009 in Cleveland, Ohio, by luring them to his home with promises of drugs and alcohol before strangling them to death and hiding their decomposing bodies throughout his house and backyard, earning him the nickname the Cleveland Strangler. The story of Anthony Sowell is a tale of horror that unfolded in the forgotten corners of Cleveland, Ohio. It is a story about how a man could kill 11 women over 2 years and live among their rotting corpses without anyone stopping him. It is a story about systemic failures, forgotten victims, and a community's pain that still echoes today. Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. From the very beginning, his life was marked by trauma and neglect that would shape him into something monstrous. He was one of 7 children born to Claudia Garrison, a single mother who struggled to provide for her large family. The household was already overcrowded, but it became even more chaotic when 7 more children moved in after Anthony's sister died from a chronic illness. The Garrison household was a place of violence and abuse. Claudia Garrison ruled with an iron fist and brutal methods. She would beat the children with electrical cords until they bled, forcing the other children to watch as she stripped them naked and whipped them mercilessly. The abuse was not just physical, but sexual as well. According to his niece Leona Davis, who moved into the household at age 9 after her mother's death, Anthony began raping her almost daily when he was just 11 years old and she was 10. The sexual abuse continued for 2 years, and Davis testified that other males in the household also participated in the assaults. Young Anthony learned early that violence was a way to exert control over others, especially women. He witnessed his grandmother's brutal punishments and participated in the sexual abuse of his cousin. The lessons he learned in that house would stay with him forever. Violence meant power. Women were objects to be used and discarded. Pain was something you inflicted on others before they could inflict it on you. As a child, Anthony was described by some as happy and attention-seeking, but there were already signs of the darkness growing inside him. He struggled in school and had difficulty forming normal relationships with other children. The constant chaos and abuse at home meant he never learned healthy ways to cope with stress or anger. Instead, he internalized the violence he witnessed and experienced, storing it up like a poison that would eventually overflow. When Anthony turned 18, he made a decision that would temporarily save him from his toxic environment. On January 24, 1978, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. For many young men from troubled backgrounds, the military can provide structure, purpose, and a chance to start over. For Anthony Sowell, it would be a brief respite from the darkness that was already growing inside him. Anthony Sowell's time in the Marines began at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island in South Carolina, where he underwent the grueling training that transformed civilians into Marines. The strict discipline and rigid structure of military life seemed to agree with him, at least on the surface. He learned to follow orders, maintain equipment, and work as part of a team. After basic training, Sowell was trained as an electrician at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. On July 13, 1978, he was assigned to the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, also in North Carolina. The technical training gave him a skill he could use both in the military and in civilian life. For a young man from a chaotic background, having a trade was important. In 1980, Sowell was sent overseas to Japan with the 3rd Force Service Support Group. This year abroad exposed him to different cultures and gave him experiences that many young men from his background never had. He served competently and without major incident, earning recognition for his work. After his year in Japan, he returned to Cherry Point to continue his service. On January 20, 1984, Sowell was ordered to Marine Corps Base Camp Butler in Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. This second overseas assignment showed that the military trusted him with important responsibilities. He spent another year in Japan before being transferred to Camp Pendleton in California for 3 days until his discharge on January 18, 1985. During his 7-year Marine Corps career, Sowell received several commendations that showed he was capable of good behavior when his environment demanded it. He earned a Good Conduct Medal with 1 Service Star, a Sea Service Deployment Ribbon, a Certificate of Commendation, a Meritorious Mast, and 2 letters of appreciation. These awards indicated that he had served honorably and competently. But the military structure that had kept Anthony's darker impulses in check was about to disappear. When he returned to civilian life in 1985, he would no longer have the strict rules and constant supervision that had helped him maintain acceptable behavior. He was about to return to the same environment that had created his problems in the first place, but now he was an adult with the physical strength and skills to do much more damage. After his honorable discharge from the Marines in 1985, Anthony Sowell returned to Cleveland and tried to build a normal life. For a few years, he seemed to be managing reasonably well. He used his electrical training to find work and tried to establish himself as a productive member of society. But the damage done in his childhood and the lack of proper support systems meant that his darker impulses were always just beneath the surface. In 1989, for years after leaving the military, those impulses finally exploded into violence. The victim was a woman named Melvette Sockwell, who was 3 months pregnant at the time. What happened to her in Anthony's house was a preview of the horrors that would come years later. Melvette had met Anthony at a motel, and he convinced her to come to his house on Page Avenue by telling her that her boyfriend was waiting for her there. It was a lie designed to lure her into his trap. Once she arrived at his house, Anthony led her up to a third-floor bedroom where he placed a knife to her throat and told her he was going to kill her. What followed was a brutal assault that lasted for days. Anthony threw Melvette onto the bed and began attacking her sexually. When she tried to fight back and begged him to stop, revealing that she was pregnant, his response was to escalate the violence. He tied her hands with a necktie, wrapped a belt around her feet, and stuffed a rag in her mouth to muffle her screams. The assault continued, with Anthony choking her repeatedly. In her own words, Melvette testified that, "He choked me real hard because my body started tingling. I thought I was going to die." The choking was not just to control her, but seemed to be something Anthony enjoyed. It was a method he would perfect and use repeatedly in the years to come. Melvette's survival came down to luck and opportunity. After assaulting her multiple times, Anthony eventually fell asleep, giving her the chance she needed. Even with her hands still bound behind her back, she managed to crawl through a window and out onto the roof. From there, she was able to signal for help, and a neighbor called the police. Anthony was quickly arrested, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Faced with the prospect of a long trial and possible conviction on more serious charges, he decided to plead guilty. On September 12, 1990, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted rape. It was a significant sentence that should have served as a warning about how dangerous he was. Anthony Sowell's 15 years in prison from 1990 to 2005 represented a crucial period in his life. This was time that could have been used for rehabilitation, therapy, and addressing the underlying issues that had led to his violent behavior. Instead, it became a time when his resentments and violent fantasies continued to grow. On the surface, Sowell appeared to be a model prisoner. He earned his GED, showing he could succeed academically when he applied himself. He worked as an electrician, using the skills he had learned in the Marines to maintain the prison's electrical systems. He attended Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, though whether this was genuine interest in recovery or simply going through the motions is unclear. He also learned to cook while working as a food handler in the prison kitchen. This good behavior in prison led some to believe that Sowell had been reformed. He followed the rules, stayed out of trouble, and seemed to be using his time productively. However, the reality was more complex. Prison provided the same kind of structured environment that had helped him in the military, but it did not address the fundamental issues that made him dangerous. During his time in prison, Sowell's thoughts often turned to women and his feelings of anger and resentment toward them. In one prison evaluation, when asked to complete the sentence that began with "women," Sowell wrote, "Just tell lies." This simple statement revealed a deep-seated hatred and distrust that had been growing since his childhood experiences of abuse and neglect. The prison system in the early 1990s was not equipped to deal with sexual offenders in the way that modern correction systems attempt to. There were no specialized treatment programs for sex offenders, no intensive therapy to address the root causes of violent behavior, and no real attempt to understand what made Anthony Sowell dangerous. He was simply warehoused for 15 years, and when his time was up, he was released back into society with no real supervision or support. Despite his apparently good behavior, the parole board recognized something troubling about Sowell. They denied his applications for early release multiple times, keeping him in prison for the full 15-year sentence. This suggested that they saw something in his record or behavior that made them reluctant to let him out early, even though he had not caused major problems while incarcerated. In 2005, after serving his full sentence, Anthony Sowell was released from prison. He was now 56 years old, and he was about to enter the most violent and destructive period of his life. The 15 years in prison had not reformed him. If anything, they had given him time to plan and fantasize about what he would do when he got out. When Anthony Sowell was released from prison in 2005, he was required to register as a sex offender and report regularly to authorities. The supervision was supposed to help ensure that he did not reoffend, but the system was underfunded and overworked. Sowell was just one of thousands of sex offenders that parole officers had to monitor, and it was impossible to watch all of them closely. Sowell moved in with his stepmother at 12205 Imperial Avenue in Cleveland's Mount Pleasant neighborhood. The house was a 3-story structure in a working-class area that had been hit hard by economic decline. Many of the neighbors were struggling with poverty, addiction, and other problems that made them vulnerable to predators like Sowell. For the first couple of years after his release, Sowell managed to stay out of trouble, at least as far as the authorities knew. He worked at a factory until 2007, when he began collecting unemployment benefits. When that ran out, he made money by collecting scrap metal, which gave him an excuse to roam the neighborhood looking for opportunities. But beneath this seemingly normal exterior, Sowell was planning and preparing. He was studying the neighborhood, identifying potential victims, and setting up his house as a place where he could commit violence without being detected. The 3-story structure gave him plenty of space to hide his crimes, and the basement provided a place where screams would not be heard by neighbors. Sowell also began cultivating relationships with women in the neighborhood, particularly those who struggled with addiction. He presented himself as a friendly neighbor who was willing to share drugs and alcohol. Many women in the area knew him as someone who would let them come to his house to get high or drink without asking too many questions. This reputation would serve him well when he began hunting for victims. The neighborhood itself was part of what made Sowell's crimes possible. Mount Pleasant was an area where people often went missing without much attention from authorities. Drug addiction was common, and women would sometimes disappear for days or weeks at a time while on binges. Families often did not report missing persons immediately because they assumed their loved ones were simply using drugs somewhere else. There was also a pervasive smell in the neighborhood that residents had been complaining about for years. The odor was so bad that it made people's eyes water and forced them to cover their noses when walking down Imperial Avenue. Most people assumed it was coming from Ray's Sausage Company, a local business that processed meat. The company even spent money trying to fix their sewer lines and grease traps to address the complaints. But the smell was not coming from the sausage company. It was coming from Anthony Sowell's house, where bodies were already beginning to decompose. By 2007, Sowell had begun killing, and the neighborhood was literally smelling the evidence of his crimes without knowing it. In May 2007, Crystal Dozier became Anthony Sowell's first victim, though it would be years before anyone would know what had happened to her. Crystal was 35 years old and the mother of 7 children. She had once lived on the same block as Sowell, so she knew him from the neighborhood. Like many women in the area, Crystal struggled with drug addiction, which had been made worse by the death of one of her sons. Crystal's sister, Annetta Bell, later said that Crystal didn't know how to deal with not having her kids around her. To find out her son had passed away, that really weighed heavily on her. The grief and pain from losing a child had driven Crystal deeper into addiction, making her exactly the kind of vulnerable person that Sowell targeted. When Crystal disappeared in May 2007, no one reported her missing. This was part of a pattern that would repeat itself over and over again. Many of Sowell's victims were women whose disappearances were not immediately noticed or reported because people assumed they were simply using drugs somewhere else. Crystal's mother, Florence Bray, later suspected that Sowell had torn down the missing person flyers that the family had put up around the neighborhood. The fact that Crystal's disappearance went unreported meant that there was no police investigation, no search for her, and no pressure on Sowell to account for what had happened. He had killed a woman and completely gotten away with it, which only emboldened him to continue. Over the next 2 years, Sowell would develop and refine his methods. He would lure women to his house with promises of drugs or alcohol, often targeting those who were most vulnerable and least likely to be missed. Once they were in his house, he would assault them sexually and then strangle them to death. The strangling seemed to be something he particularly enjoyed, as he would later tell police about dreams where he was the Punisher who strangled women. After killing his victims, Sowell would hide their bodies throughout his house and property. Some were stuffed into crawl spaces, others were buried in shallow graves in the backyard, and still others were simply left to decompose in rooms on the upper floors. He seemed to take a perverse pleasure in living among the corpses, as if surrounding himself with death gave him some kind of power or satisfaction. The smell that neighbors had been complaining about grew stronger with each new victim, but no one connected it to Sowell's house. The odor was so overwhelming that it affected the entire neighborhood, yet somehow it never occurred to anyone that it might be coming from human remains. This was partly because people trusted their assumptions about Ray's Sausage Company, but it was also because the idea that someone could be living with multiple corpses seemed too horrible to consider. After Crystal Dozier's disappearance in May 2007, Anthony Sowell waited over a year before killing again. This gap suggests that he was learning to be more careful and methodical in his approach. When he did strike again, it was with increased confidence and brutality. In June 2008, Tishana Culver became his second victim. Tishana was 31 years old and worked as a beautician. She lived just a few blocks from Sowell's house, which made it easy for him to study her habits and find opportunities to approach her. Like many of his victims, Tishana struggled with drug addiction and had multiple drug convictions on her record. Tishana's family thought she might be in jail or living with her boyfriend in Akron, which is why they did not immediately report her missing. This was exactly the kind of confusion that Sowell counted on. By targeting women whose lives were chaotic and unpredictable, he could make them disappear without triggering immediate searches or investigations. The killings began to accelerate as Sowell became more confident in his methods. In the fall of 2008, Tonia Carmichael became his third victim. Tonia was 52 years old and from nearby Warrensville. She had told a friend she was going out for some fun, which the friend assumed meant a crack binge. When Tonia did not return, her family reported her missing, but police did not seem to take the report seriously. Tonia's car was found abandoned off East 115th Street, which should have been a sign that something serious had happened to her. Police reportedly checked abandoned buildings in the area and showed her photo to residents and bar patrons in February 2009, but they never thought to check Anthony Sowell's house. If they had, they might have discovered the truth before more women died. In April 2009, 2 more women fell victim to Sowell's violence. Nancy Cobbs was 43 years old and worked in construction. She had 3 children and 5 grandchildren, as well as a history of drug abuse. Nancy lived on Griffin Avenue, just half a mile from Sowell's house. When she disappeared in April, her family waited until June to report her missing to the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, who did not contact police until August. Imelda Amy Hunter was 47 years old when she disappeared in April 2009. According to her brother, she was known to have beers at Sowell's house, which suggests she trusted him and saw him as a friend. Imelda loved to read, watch television, and do crossword puzzles. She had 3 children who loved her. When she went missing, her family searched for her desperately, but she was not reported missing until November 3rd, 2009, just days before her body would be discovered. In June 2009, Talacia Fortson became another victim. Talacia was 31 years old and the mother of 3 children. She attended church regularly and enjoyed flower arranging. Like many of Sowell's victims, a drug problem had cost her custody of her children, which may have made her more vulnerable to his approaches. Talacia was not reported missing until publicity about the bodies in Sowell's house reached her family. Also in June 2009, Janice Webb disappeared. Janice was 48 years old and the mother of 1 child and grandmother of 3. She often visited the neighborhood and was last seen by her family in June. Her family reported her missing 2 months later, but by then it was too late. Each of these women had full lives with people who loved them, but they also had vulnerabilities that Sowell exploited. Their struggles with addiction, their economic circumstances, and the chaotic nature of their lives made them perfect targets for a predator who understood how to identify and exploit weakness. While Anthony Sowell killed 11 women between 2007 and 2009, there were others who managed to escape his house of horrors. These survivors would later provide crucial testimony that helped convict him, but their experiences also showed just how close they came to becoming victims themselves. One of the most important survivors was Vanessa Gay, who encountered Sowell in September 2008. Vanessa testified that Sowell brought her to the third floor of his house to use drugs, but then suddenly punched her in the face and ordered her to take off her clothes. He repeatedly raped her over several hours, demonstrating the same pattern of violence that he used with his murder victims. During her ordeal, Vanessa saw something that would haunt her forever. When Sowell allowed her to go to the bathroom, she saw something in a room off the hallway that looked like a headless body, propped up in a seated position and taped up. This was evidence that Sowell was already killing and keeping bodies in his house, but Vanessa was too terrified to fully process what she had seen. When she returned to the bedroom after seeing the body, Sowell said repeatedly, "You're going to tell? I know you're going to tell." He was clearly worried that she would report what had happened and what she had seen. However, Vanessa managed to persuade him to let her go, probably by convincing him that she would not tell anyone. Her survival was largely due to her ability to stay calm and talk her way out of the situation. Another crucial survivor was Gladys Wade, whose attack in December 2008 should have ended Sowell's killing spree, but did not because of police failures. Gladys was walking down Imperial Avenue when Sowell approached her and wished her Merry Christmas, then asked if she wanted to share a beer with him. When she declined and tried to continue walking, he would not let her pass. What happened next was a brutal assault that followed Sowell's established pattern. He punched Gladys in the face and dragged her toward his house. He choked her until she lost consciousness, and when she woke up, she was in his house and he was ordering her to remove her clothes. Gladys fought back desperately, clawing at his eyes and trying to escape. The struggle was violent and chaotic. At some point, Gladys was able to grab Sowell between the legs and twist, causing him enough pain to give her a chance to run. She careered down the stairs, smashing her hand through glass in a door and cutting her thumb badly. Despite her injuries, she made it out of the house and flagged down a police cruiser. The police response to Gladys Wade's attack was everything that was wrong with the system that was supposed to protect women like her. The officers who responded saw that she was bleeding from a gash in her thumb and noted the red marks on her throat. They arrested Sowell and took photographs of the blood on the walls and stairs of his house, as well as Gladys's torn clothing that had been shoved into a trash can. All of this evidence clearly showed that a violent assault had taken place, and Sowell was a registered sex offender who had spent 15 years in prison for attempted rape. This should have been an easy case to prosecute, but Detective Georgia Hussein, who caught the case, failed to do her job properly. Hussein never talked to the arresting officers about what they had seen. She did not review the photographs of the crime scene or Gladys's injuries. She did not get a search warrant to look through Sowell's house, even though there was clear evidence that a violent crime had taken place there. Most importantly, she did not tell the prosecutor that Sowell was a registered sex offender who had recently been released from prison. Instead, Hussein decided that Gladys was not a credible witness. She claimed there were inconsistencies in Gladys's story and that Gladys did not look like she had been punched when she came to give a statement the next day. Based on Hussein's recommendation, the prosecutor decided there was insufficient evidence to charge Sowell, and he was released from jail after just 2 days. This failure would have devastating consequences. If Sowell had been prosecuted for the attack on Gladys Wade, he would have been sent back to prison, and at least 6 more women would still be alive today. Instead, he was free to continue killing, and he took full advantage of that freedom. After his release from jail in December 2008, Anthony Sowell seemed to become more violent and reckless. Perhaps the close call with Gladys Wade made him realize that he was running out of time, or perhaps the taste of getting away with such a serious crime emboldened him to take greater risks. Whatever the reason, the pace of his killing accelerated dramatically. In early 2009, Michelle Mason became one of his victims. Michelle's disappearance, like those of the other women, was not immediately investigated because people assumed she was simply using drugs somewhere else. This pattern of neglect was exactly what allowed Sowell to operate with impunity for so long. Kim Yvette Smith was another victim whose life was cut short by Sowell's violence. Like the other women, Kim was vulnerable due to her circumstances and her struggles with addiction. Sowell had perfected his ability to identify women who would not be immediately missed and who could be lured to his house house without suspicion. LaShanda Long was 25 years old when she became one of Sowell's victims in August 2008. LaShanda had not been seen since that time but was never reported as a missing person, though she had been reported missing twice when she was a teenager. When her remains were eventually discovered, only her skull was found, wrapped in paper and placed in a bucket in Sowell's basement. The condition of her remains suggested that Sowell had kept her skull as some kind of trophy. Diane Turner was another woman whose life ended in Sowell's House of Horrors. When police eventually searched the property, Diane's body was one of the first two that they discovered, along with Talacia Fortson. Both women had been dead for some time, and their bodies were in advanced stages of decomposition. Each of these women had become part of Sowell's collection of victims, their bodies hidden throughout his house and property like macabre decorations. Some were stuffed into crawl spaces, others were buried in shallow graves in the backyard, and still others were left to rot in rooms on the upper floors. Sowell seemed to take pleasure in living among the corpses, as if their presence gave him some kind of power or satisfaction. The smell that had been plaguing the neighborhood for years grew stronger with each new victim, but still no one connected it to Sowell's house. Neighbors continued to complain to the health department, and Ray's Sausage Company continued to spend money trying to fix problems that did not exist. The real source of the odor was just a few hundred feet away, but no one thought to investigate. On September 22, 2009, LaTundra Billups made a decision that would finally bring Anthony Sowell's reign of terror to an end, though she had no way of knowing it at the time. LaTundra knew Sowell from the neighborhood and had shared drinks with him before without any problems. When he invited her to his house to drink and get high, she saw no reason to be suspicious. This time, however, Sowell directed her to a second-floor room she had never been in before, telling her it was too messy upstairs on the third floor where he typically entertained guests. The room was practically empty except for a single blanket and an extension cord lying on the floor. This should have been a warning sign, but LaTundra had no reason to suspect what was about to happen. They proceeded to get high together in the room until Sowell left to get a chair. When he returned, he told LaTundra to turn around, which she did. But then he suddenly grabbed her by the back of the neck, causing her to shove him away and question what he was doing. His response was to punch her hard in the face. What followed was a brutal assault that followed Sowell's established pattern. He overpowered LaTundra and forced her down onto her stomach. While he was sexually assaulting her, he wrapped the extension cord around her neck and began choking her until she lost consciousness. This was the same method he had used to kill his 11 victims, and LaTundra came very close to becoming number 12. When LaTundra regained consciousness, Sowell was sitting across the room in the chair, looking shocked to see her moving. He told her that he was going to kill her and himself because he knew he was going to jail, but somehow LaTundra was able to persuade him to let her go. Her survival was due to a combination of luck, quick thinking, and perhaps Sowell's own confusion about what to do next. Unlike his previous victims, LaTundra was able to escape from the house and immediately went to the police to report what had happened. She told them that she had been raped and choked at 12205 Imperial Avenue and identified Anthony Sowell as her attacker. She also mentioned that she had left a personal item in the house, which could serve as evidence. This report should have resulted in immediate action, but once again the system failed. No patrol officers went to question Sowell immediately after the attack was reported. Instead, the case was referred to the Sex Crimes Unit, where it sat unworked for almost a month. This delay gave Sowell time to clean up any evidence and to attack another woman. In October 2009, while LaTundra Billups' case was still sitting unworked on someone's desk, Anthony Sowell struck again. This time his victim was Sean Morris, who met Sowell one morning and went to his home to drink and smoke crack. After spending 5 hours at the house, Sean left but then realized she had forgotten her identification card and returned to retrieve it. This return trip nearly cost Sean her life. When Sowell opened the door and she came inside, he immediately placed her in a chokehold and forced her upstairs. He ordered her to remove her clothes and then violently raped her, following the same pattern he had used with all his victims. What happened next was both terrifying and ultimately life-saving. When Sowell left the room to close windows to prevent her screaming from being heard, Sean saw her chance to escape. She climbed out a third-floor window and hung naked from a ledge, desperately trying to get away from her attacker. Sowell saw what was happening and tried to pull her back inside, but when he could not, he shoved her down as hard as he could. Sean fell to the ground from the third floor, was seriously injured and lost consciousness. The fall should have killed her, but somehow she survived. What happened next was witnessed by several people in the neighborhood and was captured on security camera footage from Ray's Sausage Company next door. Bystanders testified that Sowell, who was also naked, tried to bring Shawn back inside the house while she was unconscious and bleeding. A crowd gathered and tried to prevent him from moving her because of the extent of her injuries. This was the moment when Sowell's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. For years, he had been able to commit his crimes in secret, but now there were witnesses who could see exactly what kind of man he really was. Don, a man who worked in the area, later described what he saw. "That's the worst thing I've seen in my life. She was but naked, and she was bleeding out of her mouth and her nose. I saw Anthony Sowell come around the corner, and he was naked too. He said, 'Listen, that's my wife, and we were just having sex, and she fell out the window.' The whole thing seemed really strange to me." Don immediately called 911, saying it was the first time in his life he had ever called that number. Emergency personnel arrived and transported Shawn to the hospital, where she survived her injuries and was able to tell police what had happened to her. The attack on Shawn Morris was the final straw that brought police attention back to Anthony Sowell and his house on Imperial Avenue. With 2 recent reports of sexual assault and now a woman thrown from a 3rd-floor window, even the overworked Cleveland Police Department could not ignore what was happening. On October 29, 2009, police arrived at 12205 Imperial Avenue with an arrest warrant for Anthony Sowell and a search warrant for his house. Sowell was not home when they arrived, but they proceeded to execute the search warrant anyway. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The smell that neighbors had been complaining about for years hit the officers like a physical force as soon as they entered the house. It was the overwhelming stench of death and decay, so strong that it made their eyes water and forced them to cover their noses and mouths. The house was filled with trash, clothes were strewn everywhere, and there was an indescribable feeling of evil in the air. As the officers moved through the house, they made a discovery that would change everything. In the basement, they found 2 bodies that were basically sitting out in the open, decomposing. The bodies were next to a shovel, suggesting that Sowell had been in the process of burying them when something interrupted him. The officers immediately called for backup and crime scene investigators. What followed was one of the most extensive crime scene investigations in Cleveland's history. Over the course of more than a week, police and forensic experts searched every inch of the house and property. With each passing day, they found more bodies. Some were stuffed into crawl spaces, others were buried in shallow graves in the backyard, and still others were hidden in rooms throughout the house. The most disturbing discovery was LaShonda Long's skull, which was found wrapped in paper and placed in a bucket in the basement. This was not just evidence of murder, but suggested that Sowell was keeping trophies from his victims. The skull had been cleaned and preserved, indicating that Sowell had spent time with it after the killing. By the time the search was complete, police had found the remains of 11 women hidden throughout Sowell's property. Some of the bodies were so decomposed that identification was difficult, but forensic experts were eventually able to determine who they were through DNA testing and other methods. The condition of the bodies told a story of prolonged horror. Most of the victims had been strangled, though the advanced decomposition made it impossible to determine the exact cause of death for all of them. Many of the bodies showed evidence of having been bound with rope, extension cords, or strips of cloth. All of the victims were found nude from the waist down, indicating that they had been sexually assaulted before being killed. While police were discovering the bodies in his house, Anthony Sowell had disappeared into the neighborhood. For 2 days, one of Cleveland's most wanted men walked the streets freely while a massive manhunt was underway. It seemed impossible that he could evade capture for long, but Sowell knew the area well and may have had help from people who did not yet understand what he had done. On October 31st, 2009, Halloween night, police finally found Anthony Sowell walking down the street about a mile from his house. He did not resist arrest and seemed almost relieved that his time on the run was over. Officers immediately transported him to the police station, where homicide detectives Mel Smith and Lemmy Griffin were waiting to question him. The interrogation that followed was one of the most important in Cleveland police history. Detectives knew they were dealing with a serial killer who had lived among the corpses of his victims for years, but they needed to understand how and why he had done it. They also needed to determine if there were more victims that had not yet been discovered. From the beginning, Sowell appeared nervous during the interrogation, tapping his foot and fidgeting constantly. When asked how many bodies were in his house, he told the detectives there were 10 but claimed he was not actually sure, and it was just a number he threw out there. This casualness about the number of people he had killed showed just how disconnected he was from the reality of his crimes. What was most disturbing about the interrogation was that Sowell never actually confessed to killing any of the 11 women. Instead, he told a bizarre story about hearing voices in his head and blacking out. He claimed that he would sometimes hear a voice talking about bad people before he would lose consciousness. The same voice, he said, told him not to enter the room on the 3rd floor, where some of the bodies were discovered. According to Sowell's version of events, when he would come to after these blackouts, the woman he had been with would be gone, and he would feel completely drained, like he had been doing physical labor in his sleep. He told detectives that he had dreams where he strangled women, but in these dreams he was always the good guy, what he called the Punisher, because the women were doing wrong by using drugs and working as prostitutes. Despite claiming he did not remember killing anyone, Sowell did remember that these women had tried to scam him for drugs and money, at which point the voice in his head would tell him what needed to be done. He described the victims as bad ones, who deserved what happened to them, showing a complete lack of empathy or remorse for what he had done. The detectives were not fooled by Sowell's attempts to claim insanity or amnesia. They could see that his crimes were carefully planned and executed, not the result of mental illness or blackouts. He had methodically targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his house, and killed them in ways that gave him sexual satisfaction. His ability to hide the bodies and live among them for years showed a level of organization and control that was inconsistent with his claims of mental illness. As news of Anthony Sowell's crimes spread, law enforcement agencies began to wonder if his killing had extended beyond Cleveland. The FBI announced that it would investigate any possible connections to unsolved murders in places where Sowell had lived during his military service, including Parris Island, South Carolina, Cherry Point, North Carolina, Okinawa, Japan, and Camp Pendleton, California. FBI behavioral specialists visited the Sowell property and began developing a profile of the killings that could help determine if investigations needed to be opened or reopened elsewhere. The first step was to get a detailed timeline of his military service and cross-reference it with unsolved crimes in those areas. The city of East Cleveland also began reviewing 3 unsolved slayings from 1988 and 1989, after Sowell returned from military service, but before he went to prison for attempted rape. These murders had occurred during a time when Sowell was living in the area and would have had the opportunity to commit them. Police in Coronado, California, near Camp Pendleton, reported that a woman had contacted them after seeing Sowell's mugshot on television. She was convinced that he had raped her in 1979, but officers were unable to confirm her story because rape investigation records from 30 years earlier had been destroyed. While these investigations were underway, forensic experts continued to work on identifying the victims found at Sowell's house. The advanced decomposition of many of the bodies made identification challenging, but investigators were eventually able to determine the identities of all 11 victims through DNA testing, dental records, and other forensic methods. The victims were identified as Crystal Dozier, Tishana Culver, Tonia Carmichael, Nancy Cobbs, Imelda Hunter, Talacia Fortson, Janice Webb, Michelle Mason, Kim Yvette Smith, Diane Turner, and LaShanda Long. Each woman had a name, a story, and people who loved them, but they had all become victims of one man's twisted desires. On November 30th, 2009, Anthony Sowell was indicted on 85 counts related to his crimes. The charges included 11 counts of aggravated murder, one for each of the women found in his house. He was also charged with dozens of other crimes, including kidnapping, rape, abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, and felonious assault. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty, arguing that Sowell's crimes were so heinous and involved so many victims that he deserved the ultimate punishment. The case was assigned to Judge Dick Ambrose in Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court, and Sowell was represented by defense attorneys John Parker and Rufus Sims. Initially, Sowell pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, hoping to avoid conviction by claiming that he was mentally ill when he committed the crimes. This plea was consistent with the story he had told police about hearing voices and blacking out, but it would prove to be unsuccessful in court. The legal proceedings were complicated by the massive amount of evidence that had been collected from Sowell's house and the need to identify all of the victims. Forensic experts had to carefully examine each body and piece of evidence to build a complete picture of what had happened over the 2-year period when Sowell was killing. One of the most important aspects of the case was the testimony of the women who had survived attacks by Sowell. LaTundra Billups, Sean Morris, Gladys Wade, and Vanessa Gay would all testify about their experiences, providing crucial evidence about Sowell's methods and state of mind during the attacks. Anthony Sowell's trial began in 2011 and was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Cleveland's history. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, survivors of Sowell's attacks, and members of the media who were covering the case. The prosecution's case was straightforward but horrifying. They presented evidence showing that Sowell had methodically targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his house with promises of drugs and alcohol, and then sexually assaulted and strangled them to death. The physical evidence was overwhelming, including the bodies found throughout his property and forensic evidence linking him to the crimes. The testimony of the survivors was particularly powerful. LaTundra Billups described how Sowell had choked her with an extension cord until she lost consciousness, and how he had told her he was going to kill her. Sean Morris testified about being thrown from the 3rd-floor window and the injuries she sustained. Gladys Wade told the court about her attack in December 2008 and how the police had failed to properly investigate. Vanessa Gay's testimony was especially disturbing because she described seeing what appeared to be a headless body in Sowell's house during her attack in September 2008. This testimony showed that Sowell was not only killing women but keeping their bodies as trophies or decorations in his house. The defense team tried to argue that Sowell was not guilty by reason of insanity, pointing to his claims about hearing voices and blacking out. They brought in mental health experts who testified about Sowell's troubled childhood and the abuse he had suffered. However, the prosecution was able to show that Sowell's crimes were too organized and methodical to be the result of mental illness. The evidence showed that Sowell had carefully planned his attacks, had taken steps to hide the bodies and clean up evidence, and had continued killing over a period of more than 2 years. This level of organization and forethought was inconsistent with the kind of mental illness that would support an insanity defense. During the trial, Sowell showed no emotion or remorse for his crimes. He sat impassively as witnesses described the horrific things he had done, and he never expressed any sympathy for his victims or their families. Some jurors later said that his emotionless demeanor actually made it easier for them to recommend the death penalty. On July 22, 2011, after more than 15 hours of deliberation, the jury found Anthony Sowell guilty on 81 of the 85 counts against him. He was convicted of all 11 counts of aggravated murder, as well as the majority of the other charges related to kidnapping, rape, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. The verdict was a relief for the families of the victims and the survivors who had testified during the trial. It meant that Sowell would be held accountable for his crimes and would never again be free to hurt anyone else. The sentencing phase of the trial began immediately after the guilty verdict was announced. During this phase, the jury had to decide whether Sowell should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution argued that the heinous nature of his crimes and the number of victims warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense tried to present mitigating evidence about Sowell's troubled childhood and his military service, hoping to convince the jury that his life should be spared. However, the overwhelming nature of his crimes and his complete lack of remorse made it difficult to argue for mercy. On August 10, 2011, the jury recommended that Anthony Sowell be sentenced to death for his crimes. 2 days later, on August 12th, Judge Dick Ambrose accepted the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Sowell to death. The judge noted that the evidence of Sowell's troubled childhood and his military service did not mitigate the horrific nature of his crimes. During the sentencing hearing, family members of the victims were given the opportunity to make impact statements. Many spoke about the pain and loss they had experienced, and several said that they had never believed in the death penalty until they met Anthony Sowell. One survivor, who had escaped from Sowell's house, said she had to forgive him so she could move on with her life. But another relative said she hoped he would never have peace because he would have to answer to God for what he had done. After his sentencing, Anthony Sowell was transferred to the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, where he was placed on death row. He would spend the next 10 years appealing his conviction and sentence while living in isolation, waiting for his execution. Sowell's appeals focused on various legal arguments, including claims that his trial attorneys had been ineffective and that he had not received a fair trial. His lawyers argued that the extensive media coverage of the case had made it impossible for him to get an impartial jury, and they claimed that there had been errors in the way evidence was handled during the investigation. In 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court reviewed Sowell's case and affirmed both his conviction and his death sentence. In a 5-2 decision, the court found that while there had been some procedural errors during the trial, they were not significant enough to warrant a new trial or a new sentencing hearing. The court noted that, although Sowell's statements to police are incriminating, the state presented overwhelming independent evidence of guilt supporting Sowell's convictions and sentence. The physical evidence against Sowell was so strong that even if his confessions were thrown out, there was still more than enough evidence to convict him. Sowell continued to file appeals and legal challenges, but they were consistently rejected by the courts. As recently as May 2020, a 3-judge panel with the 8th District Court of Appeals unanimously held that Sowell had failed to present enough evidence that he did not receive a fair trial. By January 2021, Anthony Sowell's long legal battle was coming to an end, but not in the way that anyone expected. Prison officials noticed that Sowell was becoming seriously ill and was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He was transferred to the Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, where he could receive end-of-life care. On February 8, 2021, Anthony Edward Sowell died at the age of 61. His death was not related to COVID-19, and he died of natural causes related to his terminal illness. After more than 11 years on death row, Sowell had escaped execution by dying in prison. The news of Sowell's death brought mixed reactions from the families of his victims and the survivors of his attacks. Some felt relieved that he was finally gone and could never hurt anyone else, while others felt cheated that he had not faced execution for his crimes. Donita Carmichael, daughter of victim Tonia Carmichael, told reporters, "I am glad he is dead. God made it happen. I will never, ever forgive him." Her reaction reflected the feelings of many family members who had been waiting more than a decade for justice. The Anthony Sowell case exposed serious failures in Cleveland's law enforcement and social service systems that allowed a serial killer to operate with impunity for more than 2 years. The fact that multiple women had reported attacks by Sowell and that neighbors had been complaining about suspicious odors for years raised serious questions about how the crimes could have been prevented. In 2018, the city of Cleveland agreed to pay $1 million to the families of 6 of Sowell's victims to settle lawsuits that alleged police negligence had allowed the killings to continue. The families' lawyers argued that if Detective Georgia Hussein had properly investigated Gladys Wade's attack in December 2008, Sowell would have been arrested and at least 6 lives would have been saved. In 2019, Cleveland also settled lawsuits filed by 2 survivors of Sowell's attacks. Latundra Billups Henderson received $260,000 and Gladys Wade Thomas received $40,000 for the failures in investigating their cases. The settlements were seen as an acknowledgement that the system had failed these women, but many felt that the amounts were too small given the magnitude of the failures. Activist Kathy Ray Coleman of the Imperial Women Coalition argued that the settlements would have been larger if the victims had not been poor and Black. The case also highlighted the broader problem of missing persons investigations, particularly when the victims are women of color who struggle with addiction. Many of Sowell's victims were never reported missing, or their cases were not properly investigated because police assumed they were simply using drugs somewhere else. In the years following Sowell's conviction, community activists and family members of the victims worked to create a memorial to honor the 11 women who had lost their lives. The house where the murders took place was demolished in 2011, leaving an empty lot that served as a painful reminder of what had happened there. In 2021, after years of planning and fundraising, the Garden of 11 Angels was officially opened on the site where Sowell's house had once stood. The memorial park includes trees, flowers, and monuments honoring each of the 11 victims by name. The Western Reserve Land Conservancy, Burton, Bell, Car Development Incorporated, Land Studio, and other local organizations led the effort to create the memorial. They acquired and demolished additional adjacent properties to create a space comprising 8 parcels in total. Joy Johnson, executive director at Burton, Bell, Car Development Incorporated, said at the opening ceremony, "This beautiful garden will be a living memorial to the 11 angels whose lives were so brutally taken. It's been years in the making. We now have some closure and healing for this community. The memorial serves not just as a place to remember the victims, but as a symbol of the community's resilience and determination to heal from the trauma of Sowell's crimes. It represents hope that something beautiful can grow even in places where terrible things have happened. More than a decade after Anthony Sowell's crimes were discovered, their impact continues to be felt in Cleveland and beyond. The case changed how law enforcement agencies investigate missing persons cases, particularly when the victims are vulnerable women who may struggle with addiction or mental health issues. Training programs for police officers now emphasize the importance of taking all missing persons reports seriously, regardless of the victim's background or lifestyle. The case is used as an example of how assumptions and biases can lead to tragic consequences when investigators fail to properly pursue leads. The case also highlighted the need for better coordination between different law enforcement agencies and social service organizations. Many of Sowell's victims had interactions with multiple agencies, but information was not shared effectively, which contributed to the failure to identify patterns or connections. Mental health professionals and social workers use the Sowell case to illustrate the long-term effects of childhood trauma and abuse. While Sowell's background of abuse does not excuse his crimes, it does show how untreated trauma can contribute to the development of violent behavior. The case has also been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs that have helped raise awareness about serial killers and the importance of supporting vulnerable populations. These media portrayals have helped ensure that the victims are remembered not just as statistics, but as real people with lives and stories that mattered. The story of Anthony Sowell raises difficult questions about the nature of evil and how society should respond to it. Sowell was clearly a monster who caused immeasurable pain and suffering, but he was also a human being who had experienced significant trauma and abuse in his own life. This does not excuse or minimize his crimes in any way, but it does remind us that evil rarely emerges from nowhere. Sowell's childhood was marked by violence, abuse, and neglect that damaged him in ways that may have contributed to his later actions. While many people experience trauma without becoming violent, the combination of genetic factors, environmental influences, and individual choices can sometimes produce devastating results. The failure of multiple systems to stop Sowell before he killed 11 women also raises questions about societal responsibility. The military provided structure that helped him function for 7 years, but there was no follow-up support when he returned to civilian life. The prison system warehoused him for 15 years without addressing the underlying issues that made him dangerous. The parole system released him with minimal supervision and support. Most importantly, the law enforcement system failed repeatedly to take seriously the reports of women who were attacked by Sowell. The assumption that these women were not credible witnesses because of their backgrounds or lifestyles allowed a serial killer to continue operating for years. The Anthony Sowell case offers several important lessons for society about how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. First, it shows the importance of taking all reports of violence seriously, regardless of who the victim is. The assumption that certain people are less credible or less worthy of protection can have deadly consequences. Second, the case demonstrates the need for better support systems for people who have experienced trauma and abuse. While most trauma survivors do not become violent, providing appropriate mental health care and social support can help prevent some individuals from developing dangerous behaviors. Third, the case highlights the importance of effective communication and coordination between different agencies and organizations. Information sharing and joint investigations can help identify patterns and connections that might otherwise be missed. Fourth, the case shows the need for adequate resources for law enforcement agencies, particularly those that investigate crimes against vulnerable populations. Understaffed and overworked departments may not have the time or resources to properly investigate all cases, which can allow dangerous individuals to continue harming others. Finally, the case reminds us of the importance of community engagement and support for vulnerable populations. Many of Sowell's victims were isolated and marginalized, which made them easier targets. Strong community connections and support systems can help protect people who might otherwise be vulnerable to predators. The 11 women who died at the hands of Anthony Sowell were more than just victims of a serial killer. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends who had hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their lives were cut short by violence, but their memory continues to inspire efforts to protect other vulnerable women. Crystal Dozier was a mother of 7 who struggled with grief after losing one of her children. Hannah Culver was a beautician who lived just blocks from where she would die. Tonya Carmichael was looking for some fun when she encountered evil instead. Nancy Cobbs was a construction worker with 3 children and 5 grandchildren. Imelda Hunter loved to read and do crossword puzzles. Talacia Fortson attended church regularly and enjoyed flower arranging. Janice Webb was a grandmother who visited the neighborhood where she would meet her death. Michelle Mason, Kim Yvette Smith, Diane Turner, and LaShonda Long were all women with their own stories and their own dreams that were never fulfilled. These women have become symbols of all the vulnerable people in our society who need protection and support. Their deaths were preventable tragedies that occurred because multiple systems failed to do their jobs properly. But their memory serves as a reminder of what can happen when we fail to value and protect all members of our community. The Garden of 11 Angels stands as a testament to their lives and as a promise that they will not be forgotten. It represents not just loss and grief, but also hope and renewal. It shows that even in places where terrible things have happened, beauty and life can flourish again. The story of Anthony Sowell is ultimately a story about failure, the failure of systems, institutions, and individuals to protect vulnerable people from a predator in their midst. It is a story about how assumptions, biases, and neglect can have deadly consequences. But it is also a story about resilience, justice, and the power of communities to heal and move forward. Anthony Sowell died in prison in 2021, escaping the execution that many felt he deserved. But his death marked the end of a long and dark chapter in Cleveland's history. The 11 women he killed are remembered not as victims, but as human beings who mattered, who were loved, and who deserved better from the society that failed to protect them. Their legacy lives on in the changes that have been made to how missing persons cases are investigated, in the training that police officers receive about domestic violence and sexual assault, and in the memorial garden that bears their names. Most importantly, their legacy lives on in the ongoing efforts to protect vulnerable people and to ensure that no one else has to suffer the way they did. The story of Anthony Sowell reminds us that evil exists in our world, but it also reminds us that we have the power to fight against it. We can choose to believe victims when they report crimes. We can choose to investigate thoroughly rather than making assumptions. We can choose to provide support and resources for people who need help. We can choose to remember and honor those we have lost. The 11 angels who died on Imperial Avenue will never be forgotten. Their story continues to teach us about the importance of vigilance, compassion, and justice. In their memory, we must do better. We must be better. We must ensure that their deaths were not in vain. Anthony Sowell's reign of terror lasted from 2007 to 2009, but its impact will be felt for generations. The women he killed, the survivors who escaped, the families who grieved, and the community that had to heal all became part of a larger story about human nature and the choices we make. It is a story that reminds us that while we cannot always prevent evil from existing, we can choose how we respond to it. The Cleveland Strangler is dead, but the lessons of his crimes live on. In the end, that may be the most important part of this entire tragic story, that from great evil, we can still find ways to create something good, something meaningful, something that honors the memory of those we have lost and protects those who remain. The 11 angels of Imperial Avenue rest in peace, but their voices still speak to us, reminding us of our responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to believe the victims, and to never forget that every life has value and meaning. In their memory, we must continue to fight for justice,